Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually, for Genealogy, a program brought to you through partnership with Ames Public Library and Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan. I'm the Adult Services Manager at Ames Public Library. For those of you with us in person, this room is equipped with an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. To use that, please switch your hearing aid to T. For those of you with us virtually on Zoom, we'll be muting your microphones during the presentation. So if you have any questions, please submit those via the chat function, which you can find a link to at the bottom of your screen. And I will be monitoring the chat to make sure that your questions get shared at an appropriate time. If you get bumped out of the Zoom meeting, just follow the original link to get back to us, and you'll be able to get right back in. Live captioning is also enabled. So if you are not seeing captions and would like to, you can turn the captions on by clicking the CC transcript button in your Zoom menu bar. For everyone, today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the event. There will be time for questions at the end. So as I said, if you're on Zoom, your questions will be read by me. If you're with us live, I will come around with this microphone to hopefully get you to ask your question into the microphone so that the folks on Zoom can hear as well. And with that, please welcome Linda McCann.
Well, I know some of you have heard me before, so I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got started in this. I always say I very much stumbled into it. I was working on genealogy and was completely surprised to find out I was descended from the founder of the town where I live, Shell Rock, up by Waverly, Shell Rock. And my family didn't live there. I didn't know anything about it, but here I find out I'm descended from the founder. So I'm getting into old books and trying to trace down things and stuff. And one of the things that got my interest were there were 8 named locations around Shell Rock that I had never heard of. At that time, we had lived there like 20 years and I hadn't heard of these places. And then to find out they had a name and this sort of thing. So I talked about it a lot, I have the feeling, because the museum came to me and asked if I would write a book about it. And we self-printed it. It was very simple, stapled the pages together, all that. Well, I got a phone call from a publisher's agent over at Creighton University. And the guy had seen this very simple book, and he was wondering if I could write a county-wide book and could we have a series? And I kind of went, I think so. So that became Butler County, which is where I live. Well, then we had kind of an argument about the name of it. The publisher wanted to call these ghost towns. And I said, they're not ghost towns. They're hayfields and cornfields and cemeteries. And somewhere I said something about them being lost to history. And that's where the lost towns came in. So I began working on different counties and I kept stumbling onto stuff. The first thing I stumbled into was the Cedar Valley Road. And this was an electric train that ran between Waverly and Cedar Rapids. Do you ever hear of it? I didn't either. Ran till 58. Again, never heard of it. And I was able to talk to people that had ridden it and it changed their life, that sort of thing. So, you know, I very much stumble into a new book. So I had thought of doing Rosie probably 8 or 10 years ago, and I just couldn't find any women to talk to. By that time, I had discovered I really liked talking to people that had lived it. They could tell me things that I wouldn't think of a question to ask, you know. And so with not being able to find any Rosies, I kind of dropped it. I moved on to my POW book and went on. Well, I was talking about the POW book down by Mount Pleasant, and I overheard a lady say that she'd been a Rosie. Well, that pricked up my ears. And so when things calmed down, I went over to her and I said, I think I heard you say you'd been a Rosie. And she starts telling me about it. She had gone to California and worked in this stuff. And so again, when I could kind of say something, I said, well, as you can guess, I'd love to write about this, but I don't know how to find the women that had worked as Rosies. She went to her purse and pulled out her phone and starts doing stuff, and she's got all these women on her phone. She was actually one of the women that helped start the Rosie Foundation, and she had all this information on the women on her phone. And I said, would you be able to sort out the ones that had an Iowa connection? And she said, I'll do better than that. I'll call them. If they'll talk to you, I'll let you know. I spoke to 35 women with an Iowa connection that worked as Rosies. And again, they could tell me stuff that I would never think of, you know. So at that time, my granddaughters were about in high school or maybe just starting college. And they were always asking me, what are you working on? What's new? And so when they asked me, I said, Rosie the Riveter. My oldest granddaughter, who was in college, said, what? I thought that wasn't real. I said, well, and I'll tell you exactly what I told her, and I've been telling people. It actually was a made-up woman, but these women worked. And what it was, the government realized they had to encourage these women to go to work. And many of the women thought they needed their husband's permission to go to work. And of course, the men are off fighting the war. And so the government hired Norman Rockwell, and they gave him a bunch of pictures that had been taken at these plants with the women working. He put several pictures together and came up with Rosie. And that's where Rosie the Riveter came in. Like I said, it wasn't a single person, but it was a made-up person sort of thing. Well, beside Rosie, we had Wendy the Welder, Assembly Line Annie, and assembly lines really weren't much in use prior to World War II because men didn't like to do that, and their hands were too big and stuff. Well, women loved the assembly line because they got to talk, you know. We also had Betty the Bucker, who held the stuff for Rosie, and we had Jenny on the job. Now, evidently in the beginning, the women kind of took advantage of their freedom, if you will. And so there's a poster out there, and if you're interested, just put Rosie the Riveter posters on the internet. There's a poster out there that shows a very dressed up lady, all made up, dressed up, carrying her heels and standing at a time clock punching in. And the caption is, you can't work if you don't sleep. So again, they were trying to get through to the women that they couldn't go out and party all night and then go to work, you know. So again, it's just interesting how they use these posters to get people's attention and that sort of thing. Well, one of the interesting things I ran across is Ronald Reagan enlisted in the Army the day after Pearl Harbor. And he went around filming the women working. And these films were played at movie theaters and this sort of stuff, again, to encourage the women. Well, he filmed a lady out in California. And when he finished, he said to her that he really thought she could be in pictures. And if she was interested, he would try to help her. Well, she was interested, and he helped her get some stills, and then he did some filming. This lady became a very well-known movie star. Any guesses? And don't think his wife's, Ronald Reagan's wife's, no. Any other guesses? How about Norma Jean Baker? Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn Monroe very much gives him the credit for her becoming a Hollywood star. So again, we never know. Well, with finding these women to talk to, I was actually able to go down to Southeast Iowa a couple times, and there was a group down there that had been working very hard to stay in contact, and they would meet a couple times a year just to talk and catch up and this sort of thing. Well, they invited me to come to one of the meetings, And I had been told I couldn't tape them, I couldn't record them, I couldn't take notes, and I couldn't ask questions. Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. So one of the things they were talking about was, again, needing to get their husband's agreement that they go to work and this sort of thing. And as they were talking about it, I noticed the lady take an envelope out of her purse and just kind of cradle it. And so they're talking about it and, that they had to wait for their husbands, okay, and then they went to work. Well, this one lady with the envelope finally kind of inches herself forward and she said, "This is the letter I wrote to my husband." It hadn't been opened. And she said, "He died before he got it." And she said, "When this letter came back to me, I felt like it was him telling me I could go to work." So I did. Again, wow. So these ladies are talking about it all. And they had been kind of cautious for the times. They weren't sure this was for real and what's going to happen when they go and some of this stuff. So several of them decided they were going to a nearby plant and just ask questions. So they went to the plant. They didn't even get in the gate. Somebody stopped them at the gate, and the person said to them, the man said to them, "You can't come in until you cut your hair and you get pants." And the guy closed the gate and walked away. Well, again, as they're talking this, they're wondering why they went to work there, because of being treated this way and such. Well, so little by little, they decide to go to it. So they go to work and they got their clothes. Now, the thing was, I wished I'd been able to ask them where they got their pants because, maybe some could fit in their husbands, but otherwise, where'd they get them, Anyway, so they're talking about it and going and such. And they get there and they're actually brought into a room and kind of talked through stuff and this sort of thing. And then they have to sign this contract. This was a contract that they had to sign. If they refused to sign it, they could not work there. And this was a contract saying that they would not talk about what they did during the war for 50 years after the end of the war. They could not talk about it for 50 years. And again, the women said right out, they wished they could have discussed it with their husbands because, again, why are they having to sign this and all that? Well, I later found out that the military and several other things were having to sign these also. But, in the beginning, I was shocked about it too. So the women went to work. Well, one of the things that I think every woman said to me about first off, they said, "We never got any training." And I mean, every one of them has said it. And what it was, they would be shown how to do something, and that was that. They were supposed to do it. And while we were talking about this, one of the ladies said that there was a poster, a Rosie poster that said, "If you can run your kitchen mixer, you can run a drill press." And this lady said, "Not true." So again, they're encouraging the women are finding out difficulties, this sort of stuff. So the very first day the women went to work, and these are the women down in Southeast Iowa, there was a problem. There were no women's restrooms. Nowhere. Because there had never been women in the plant. Now, at their plant, some of the men went and cleaned one of the restrooms, and that became the restroom for the rest of the time. Now, up in Northwest Iowa, when I talked to a group of women, they said they had to use a porta potty and they had to use it the whole time in the winter too, that sort of thing. So again, here's a problem and how are we going to address it? Well, so the women went home, and again, they're telling me they had a lot of, "Is this worth it? What am I doing to bring my husband home?" This sort of thing. So the next day they went, and that day another problem popped up. there was no way to get these women to work where they needed to go. The buses only ran Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You know, that didn't work with most of these schedules. And at the same time, it turned out the grocery stores were closed weekends because nobody bought groceries on weekends, you know. Laundromats, even the bus companies only ran Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And so how are the women going to get to where they need to be? And it's kind of interesting to see what some of them figured out. Burlington Ordnance Plant down in southeast Iowa, they actually went through their records and they would put this group of women together and a car would pick them up. And then they'd go and, okay, we got 8 women over here, we can pick them up. They figured they could put 8 women in these cars with a man driver. Well, that kind of really, I'm going, 8 women and the driver? Finally, one day my husband said to me, they didn't have seatbelts. Oh, yeah, that's true, you know. But again, they ran into a problem because a woman alone would not get into the car if there was only the man driver. A woman could not be in a car, not her husband, if there was no other women around. So, you know, it's just these kind of things that kept popping up, and how do we address it and such. A lot of companies started different shifts, so maybe that would work out and such. So again, it's just kind of, we got a problem, what are we going to do? Very soon, another problem approached, and this was a bigger one. The government had lowered the age for women to go to work in these factories to 16. So school attendance dropped by 25% just because of this change. And there went a bunch of babysitters. You know, you think you're leaving them with high school kids and stuff, and they're not there anymore. They're out working too. Now, from what I understand, most of the women that stayed in Iowa had relatives that they could use and they could work it out. But again, there were a lot of women that left the state, and mostly to California and Washington State. And again, what are they going to do? They don't know anybody, this sort of stuff. Well, a lot of companies started what they called victory shifts. And these were shifts where the women went to work at like 10 o'clock at night, and they worked till 5 in the morning, and their children were home alone. You know, and think about it, that was done at that time, you know. So again, it was the companies trying to figure things out. Now, I'm having trouble thinking of the name. Boeing up in Washington State and one of the places down by Burlington both started daycares, first daycares, you know, that they could bring their children with them to work and such. So again, it's just all these little things that are coming forward, and how do we fix it and go on? Well, like I said, the women had said they really received no training. And so I was able to talk to a lady that had worked at Raft Packing Company in Waterloo. And again, prior to World War II, it was not thought that women working in packing plants was not appropriate work for women. Well, of course, with the war, it was okay for them to go to work in these plants. So this woman was working at Raft, and she was skinning animals and this sort of thing. And one day she said to her husband that there was something wrong with her knife. Well, her husband was working at Raft also because he was too old for the military. And he asked her, did you sharpen it? She said, what's that? Well, he told her to bring her knife home. And so she brought her knife home the next night. He showed her how to sharpen it, and she could not believe the difference. Well, she told me the next day she went to work and she spent the whole day teaching all these other women how to sharpen their knife. And I did say to her, what did your foreman or whatever say? And she said, they didn't care. I was teaching them stuff they needed to know. That was it, you know. And so again, it's just interesting to think through this stuff and what's going on and such. Now, the women had to wear slacks, and that was something that really upset a lot of the men. And these women down in Southeast Iowa were telling me that there was a guy that waited at the gate every afternoon when they came off work. And he was on the sidewalk across the street. And they said he would just watch the women come through, and eventually he'd walk behind one woman home. And they told me they didn't know what was going on, so 2 or 3 of them walked behind him all the way home. And they said he never spoke to the woman, he never did anything. And I said, well, do you think he was like escorting them to keep them safe or something? And they didn't have a clue. They didn't know why he was doing this. Now, I was able to say that to this group down in Southeast Iowa and a few others, I asked about sexual harassment. And the women did say, yes, there was harassment. And they said it was as simple as, I'll help you with that job if you do such and such, or I'll teach you to do this if you do such and such. The women claimed they didn't know any woman that did anything or all of that, and they didn't know of any woman that got in trouble for not doing it, but again, it was going on. Now, the women were not paid the same wages as men. The men got approximately $56 a week. The women got $31 a week. And that would be about like $600 a week now. Now, the War Production Board issued a statement nationwide, radio stations, newspapers, all this stuff, that said no one's wages should depend on their sex. That's all it said. Nothing changed. So, like I said, the women were doing this dangerous work and being paid less than the men. From December of 41 till January of 44, 37,000 women were killed on the job working in these plants. This is nationwide, but still 37,000 in 4 years. And 210,000 women were permanently disabled. And again, wow, you know. So now, for whatever reason, I thought most of the women had left Iowa and went west mostly. I don't know why I had that idea, where it came from, any of this. But when I started researching, again, I was just completely surprised that here in Iowa, we had 70 companies with military contracts. In Iowa, there were 70 companies that were depending on women to get their job done. You know, wow, I was shocked. The largest contract was to the Iowa Transmission Company of Waterloo, and they made bulletproof transmissions for tanks. And this was part of John Deere. The contract was for $10 million in 1940 dollars, you know. Before I get into the Rosies a lot, I want to share just some other stuff that I ran into. And again, I didn't know this stuff. There were several other groups that organized and worked to help during the war. And again, you know, I didn't know about them. The largest group was called the American Volunteer Service. They sold war bonds, they spotted for planes, they worked canteens, just all this kind of stuff, and they worked for nothing. This was the largest organization, and there were 325,000 women that did this kind of work. Now, nationwide, they estimate about 19 million worked as Rosies. But, you know, here we've got this other organization that's got 300,000 women working. Next, there were what was called the Liberty Girls. And these are the women that did men's work, if you will. Pick up garbage, fight fires, drive taxis, work as operators, all this kind of stuff. Again, the women did to take. I never thought about how the garbage got picked up, you know? Then there were something called the farmerettes. And again, the farmerettes functioned during World War I. And we had women working during World War I also, which I didn't know. So farmerettes were women that would go to the farm and work in the fields and this sort of stuff. And they were hoping they could get enough women to take the men's places and the men could go into the army or into the military. And again, they were trying to increase the food production because, again, we needed it to help our allies and all this sort of stuff. I ran into this group when I was in Des Moines before the book came out. And the Des Moines Women's Club was in the newspaper as they had decided that was where they were going to work. They were going to work as farmerettes. Well, I was talking about this down there, and a woman said, "Oh yeah, they talk about that all the time." And I said, "Well, do you have any pictures?" And she, "No," because I was trying to find pictures of how these women went to go work in the field, you know, but I never came up with them. Then there were the WWIIs, and these are the women that trained mostly in Navy, but a lot with police service. These women were trained at UNI, or the State Teachers College. 14,000 women were trained at UNI during these years. And I actually, again, was able to talk to a woman that had worked as a WWII in Cedar Falls. She had to work Christmas Day. And she said mostly what it was like patrolling. They did carry a gun. They had been trained to shoot it. But again, they had a uniform. They were just kind of out there showing they were out there. Well, this woman tells me that she had to work Christmas Day, and she couldn't believe how many people came out of the houses and gave them pie and thanked them for their work. So I guess we were nice then too, huh? Then there were a couple other groups. There were wipers, and these are the women that worked in the railroad engines. And they mostly worked, Clinton had them, Fort Dodge had them, Council Bluffs had them. And when a train engine arrived at a station, these women went to the engine, they cleaned the windows, they checked the fluids, you know, just whatever it needed done to get the engine back on the rails. And that was their job. And then there was a group called the Wires. And these are the women that worked in radio and electricity. So all these groups are going on other than the Rosies. So like I said, there were 70 companies, that had contracts here in Iowa. For Ames, the only one I found was the Ames Canning Company that they grew sweet corn locally. They had 2,000 acres under contract and packed 148,000 cases of corn. They employed 75 women to do this. Around Des Moines, of course, there was a lot of action. And the ordnance plant that is called the Des Moines Ordnance Plant actually was in Ankeny. And they produced armor-piercing ammunition for tanks. They had 219 buildings on 2,500 acres. And at the peak of production, they employed 19,400 women. Wow. Now, one of the things, both in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and out on the coast, LA and Washington, Seattle, had a real housing problem because the women were coming to these big cities to work and didn't have a place to live. Well, of course, they couldn't build stuff for them. So there's in the newspapers about, do you have an extra room? Can you help somebody out? This sort of thing. And early on, the companies and apartments didn't seem to learn the women were coming into LA or Seattle or wherever, and they didn't know where to go. There was nobody there. I got a phone call down from Southern Iowa, and the guy said his aunt had went to California to work. And he said she had been talking about it. And he said one morning we got up and she had left us a note, gone to California. Well, she later told him that she had got to California, she got off the bus and didn't know what to do. So she stood there just kind of looking around, and a guy came up to her and said, "You look like you're lost. Can I help you?" She told him what the problem was, and he said, well, he did have a friend that had an extra room. Why didn't they go there and they'd see what they could do? Well, it was a married couple, and they did have an extra room, and they let this lady live in it. And she lived in it the whole rest of the war. The next morning, this guy and the married woman took this lady from Iowa around and got her a job. And wow. Now, as I was hearing this, I kept expecting to hear, and that woman, my aunt, married this guy, but he didn't say that. Again, it was just something I was expecting. So again, these women are going there, but where do they work? Where do they live? All this. Well, like I said, a lot of these women did figure out that if they lived together, there would be somebody overseeing their kids all the time. So that was one of the things they did. But again, these women were always getting more people because there was no place for them to go. Another fact was the Boyd Harness Company, and they had the most actual contracts as anybody in Iowa. They had 1,400 separate contracts for the military. They made gun covers, cartridge belts. They employed 2,800 people, and over 100 were Black women. And this is the first time that the Black and white women worked together. And I was able to talk to a couple women, and they said, yeah, they just accepted us, and we did our work, and they did theirs, and that was that. John Deere had a plant in Ankeny. There was also a Devlon Engineering in West Des Moines that did magnetos and small engine parts. And that company worked 60-hour weeks. And then there was Des Moines Glove. They made 15,000 pairs of cowhide gloves for the military. And so that's one of the things, again, that surprised me, was how many of these things didn't necessarily have stuff depending on the military, uniforms, all of this. Now, one of the plants that really got my interest, and I did a little extra work on it, was, just a minute, Overlook Mink Farm of Anthon, Anthon. And this is southeast of Sioux City. Well, I was out in that area a few years ago, so I was able to do a little research. And they actually raised mink, and then the women skinned them, and the pelts were sent to New York City to insulate pilots' clothing. The planes had no heat, and so they had to make sure the pilot and others were warm. And so they used mink to insulate, and the mink came from Iowa. Now, the person I talked to said this company closed just soon after the war, but they functioned all through the war. There was one aircraft plant in Iowa, and that was at Des Moines, and it was the only aircraft plant in Iowa. And I could find nothing as to what kind of aircraft they were making or not. The interesting thing is, I think I was shocked and a little surprised at how much ammunition was being used here in Iowa. Well, some of you may know Chamberlain Manufacturing in Waterloo. That again made ammunition. They produced bombs. They sent 110 carloads of bombs per month, and they employed 350 women. Well, in the late 80s, Chamberlain finally closed, and somebody suggested some sort of inspection be done, and it was found that the ground was so full of all this ammunition, lead, cyanide, all of this, that it could not be sold and could not be used. Well, it just so happens last December, somebody tried this again. And again, they said it's still so full of all these contaminants. And that was one of the things, especially with Chamberlain, the women were ending up with different kinds of cancers. You know, they went to work to help everybody and harmed themselves. Anybody know of any company they think might have hired women and they want to learn something about it? I can't touch on every one, you know. One of the things that surprised me, and I had heard this before, there was actually a federal law passed that no washing machine factories could operate in the US. They needed them making washers and other transmissions for the military. So there was actually a federal law passed that no washing machine factories could be made. Well, my dad told me about how when he was a kid, his parents kind of argued that his mother was going to get a washing machine as soon as the war ended, and his dad wanted a tractor. And again, as a kid, I never asked who won. Well, that got me thinking about tractors, because again, you know, okay, was there a law that tractors couldn't be made? Well, all the tractor dealers ended up with contracts to do stuff for tanks and ammunition and that sort of thing. And again, they continued to operate. John Deere really used the assembly line, and they had 769 women on the assembly line there. Pace in Burlington produced howitzer shells, airplane wings, and anti-aircraft guns. So again, they were still using that. Pardon me? I'm looking. Well, and like I said, they couldn't operate, but Maytag actually began making all the different kinds of washers from, you know, so that's how they switched over. B, starting with a B? Well, I don't have it, but, you know, who knows? Yeah. Now, like I said, with the women leaving the state, these are places that I could definitely tie down Iowa women went to. One was Beechcraft Aircraft in Wichita. Of course, Boeing up in Seattle. They employed 50,000 people during the war, and over half were women. Now, they were supposedly known for their good pay. Women were paid 62 cents per hour, and that was one of the highest wages in the industry at that time. That's like $11 per hour now. One place that I found interesting was Curtis Candy Company in Chicago. And again, I was able to talk to somebody. They made the chocolate that went into the MRIs and that sort of thing. And the lady said to me that they had been told they could eat all the chocolate they wanted. She said, you know, after a while, that wasn't all that good. Rock Island Arsenal was on an island in the Mississippi. And again, they had trouble getting people to the island, you know, because it was an island. Douglas Aircraft in California employed 22,000 people to build bombers. And again, women were more than half their people. So you know, the women are out there working, they're doing the best they can with their kids, where they've got kids and stuff. And I heard from a lot of people that the women kind of followed the men around. When they went to basic training, the women went to LA. Then when they might get sent up to Washington State, the women would move up there because they could always find a job, you know. And that took them closer to their husband in some of this. Most of the women that went out of state did return to Iowa, and some were just right away, as fast as they could. One woman told me that she had stayed because her husband stayed in the military and he was out there. She said they came back to Iowa for a family event, and she said, I told my husband we were moving back. You know, normal. The women had to live with, get through discrimination. They had to do, they had their behavior was questioned all the time. What were they doing? Why were they doing it? Can I help you? Sort of thing. They had difficulties with babysitters. There were no other women, adults in the house, and they were rationing food. So, you know, the women were really dealing with a lot of things. A survey was done in 1945, early 1945, asking the women if they could continue working when the war was over, would they? Nationwide, 75% of the women said they would continue working if they could. Now, the women had been told from the time they went to work that they were just holding this job for their husband, that they would be done the day the war ended, that sort of stuff. So the women helped to produce 296,000 airplanes, 102,000 tanks, 37,000 artillery pieces, 47 million tons of ammunition, and 87,000 warships. The women were involved with building all this. You know, I couldn't believe it, that this all got built. And I came to the conclusion we probably wouldn't have won the war without the women, you know. So the women know they're going to get fired, they're going to be out of a job. And they were told to take the stuff out of their lockers or whatever, because when they were done, they were done. They were not going to get to go back to their lockers or anything like that. So again, this group down in Southeast Iowa told me they went to leave one day, and as they were leaving, there was some sort of backup at the gate. So when they got to the front of the line, the war had ended. That's how they found out the war was ended. They had to turn in their IDs and all this sort of stuff, and they were done. That was it, simple as that, you know. One woman in the line actually did want to go back and get something, and they wouldn't let her back, you know. That was it. Now, again, as I'm talking to the women, I'm kind of thinking money, because, you know, some of these guys didn't get home for a year, so what are they going to do and stuff? And the women said right to me, it wasn't the money. We didn't work for the money. We were getting money from our husbands and such. They said it was the sociability. They had learned to socialize with each other and enjoyed it, and now they were going to lose the interaction because they weren't working, you know. And the women said to me, this was why it was a big deal that we were going to stay in contact. Well, at the same time the women were getting checked out to leave the gate, they had to sign another one of these contracts that they would not talk about what they did for the war for 50 years. And, you know, at that time, they just signed it and went on. Well, I've heard from a lot of people wanting to find out about their mothers or grandmothers or whoever, you know. And all I can tell them is to try the Rosie Foundation, but I don't think there's any records because they just didn't keep this stuff. I actually had an interaction that until I wrote this book, I didn't understand it all. So I worked as an RN at Sartori Hospital. And one day, somebody on the floor told me that our ward clerk had been a Rosie. Well, I liked history then, so somewhere I said to her, I heard you were a Rosie. What did you do? She said, I can't talk about it. Well, knowing me, I bugged her for several days. And it was always, I can't talk about it. In 1995, and I know the year because it was the year my oldest granddaughter was born, we were in a store in Cedar Falls. My mother-in-law, my daughter, my granddaughter, and me. And this lady comes up and starts talking to my mother-in-law. And I'm kind of standing there going, is that Evelyn? Well, it looks like it could be Evelyn. And I'm just, should I say something? She never would talk to me before, all this stuff. So I'm just about to say something and she walks away. Well, I had for my mother-in-law, because I'm going to ask her if that was Evelyn. The lady turned around and came back. She came right up to me and she said, I worked for the FBI and I broke code. And she turned around and walked away. And again, I didn't put this all together until I wrote this book. And she couldn't talk about it, and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, we're losing so many of these stories. And again, I've had so many people say that their mother wouldn't talk about it or she couldn't talk about it and such. And so if you know somebody that had been a Rosie, see if they'll talk to you now. And I'm sure the genealogy or the historical society would help you get somebody to interview them if you find someone. Because again, we're going to lose those stories and they're out there. They've got good stories. Well, I won't go so far as saying that this was the beginning of women's lib, but I do think it was the beginning of women telling their daughters, you can do anything you want to do. And I think that's what came out of it. Questions, comments? Yeah. Yeah, you.
Yeah. Here, I'm coming.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wondered, okay, so the women find out the war ended and their jobs, they're no longer working at the plant. So who's working? Because the guys are still overseas for at least another year or so.
Well, there were a certain amount of men that were too old for the military that were working. And the interesting thing is, I found in the Cedar Rapids paper, just a day or two later, that 33 companies in Cedar Rapids had received telegraphs the night before. The telegraph told them that the war was over, close down your plant, everybody's out of work, and now you need to separate our equipment, tools, items out from your own. So supposedly all the places closed, and then they evidently brought more men in or whoever to help them separate stuff to get the government stuff out, Anything else?
Questions. Number one, did any of the Rosie the Riveters include women that maybe worked in Washington at, doing paperwork or whatever they did for the Pentagon or a White
Oh,
House
yeah,
or anything?
definitely. This is just like this lady I talked to. She worked for the FBI breaking code.
Well, that's what she told you.
Yeah. Who knows?
Who knows, right? And
But yeah, all of the Washington DC stuff had.
I think my mother and mother-in-law both worked in Washington DC. At the time, I didn't know, like you mentioned, I didn't know anything about Rosie work, and I didn't ask either one of them, but I'm sure they did. The other question is, and this is just me being nosy, were the workers, the female workers, were they paid from the company's profits, or were they paid by the US taxpayer at the time,
They were being paid by the company they worked for.
which is the way it should be? Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Very
Anyone
interesting,
else?
by the way.
Go ahead,
I'm
right up
coming.
here.
Another company in Ames that was in the war effort was Collegiate Manufacturing. They won the Army Navy E Award for war production.
Yeah,
And I can't remember exactly what they switched to making. They made pennants and stuffed animals after the war.
Hmm.
Maybe someone else knows.
Just have a couple little comments. My grandma worked at the ordnance in Ankeny, I found out. This is just some dialogue from my mom and my sister. She worked at the ordnance plant in Ankeny. Mostly women and all the eligible men went to war. She mentioned a man called Old Bill who was 4F, which meant rejected for combat, but he was able to work there. They made all sorts of parts for planes, 30 and 50 caliber machine gun bullets, 3 shifts a day, and mom worked the night shift is what she said. And then just in context, as a single woman, if I were to go to a train station and then decide to live with someone that I met at the train station that day, like I imagine my parents would not be happy with me.
well, but this was that many years ago.
Yeah, exactly. It's just fascinating. And then another thing too, kind of along the same thread, if you're interested in history, the Roland Historical Society shared on Facebook today that the canning company in Roland stayed open in 1945. It was staffed by German POWs from the camp in Eldora. And that was just something that I thought was interesting too. So.
Well, and that's it. We had POWs in Iowa. And again, I think Iowans would have starved if we didn't have the POWs working in the fields and the canning factories and such. Every state but 3 had POWs. Yeah. Anything else?
Making me work.
Is there any evidence that you found that there was any espionage in these factories where any of the women that you didn't uncover any?
I could find nothing that pointed any of that. You know, of course, there's talk and everything, and I found nobody was charged with anything or any of that. Anything else?
What happened to these towns in Iowa after a lot of these plants or companies were closed down or, lost a lot of the workers that were putting in income into those cities?
So you talking about the towns or?
Yeah, you said these
Okay.
women worked in Iowa, in a lot of these towns and other states also, but I just
Well-
wondered what happened to the economy after all these women had to leave their jobs and go home after they were probably, spending money in those little
Yeah.
towns and.
Well, the lost towns have nothing to do with the Rosies. So first off that. And then, of course, we went into some recession after the war and all of that. And again, it's just getting everything operating again. So, did you want to know something about the lost towns?
Actually, have you talked about that yet? I came a little late.
I'll give you a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay, these lost towns in many cases had a name because they were either a post office, they were a stop on the railroad, or a stop on the stagecoach. Yeah, thanks for reading my mind. So that's where most of the names came from. They were something with this. Well, again, when the post office's rural-free delivery is really what did away with a lot of these named locations, because then they got their mail delivered to home. They didn't need, to have the post office tried to have a post office 5 miles apart. In the late 1800s, it was thought a horse could travel 12 miles a day. So they wanted these post offices every 5 miles. So somebody could go get their mail and go back home, you know. And so most of them were in somebody's house or whatever. Now, a lot of the postmasters were actually women. The men had the title, but you know, the women did the work. But again, they learned to carry some of the necessities, flour, sugar, that sort of stuff. So somebody went to get their mail, they could maybe pick up some groceries, sort of thing. Now, some of these towns got enough buildings, you know, maybe the railroad put a hotel in. So it was a stop there, that sort of thing. So maybe it got enough buildings and enough businesses to continue to operate, and the post office continued. But you know, the ones that depended on just the post office, they pretty well closed in the 1890s. Now, a lot of people still call these areas that name, and that was what I was trying to get through to with these grandkids, that I took them around these places and they'd go, "Why are we here?" "Well, this was the town of such and such." And they went, "What? What was here?" And, you know, I could tell them what had been there and this sort of thing. But, and many of these places are still called by this name. If you're interested in a certain area, you can go to, I think it's Iowa State website. If it's not, it's Iowa. But put in digitalized newspapers in the Iowa State Library search engine. And you can pull up all these old newspapers back into the 1860s and 70s. And you can find when a post office started and when it closed. And, you know, a lot of times creameries came in because, again, the farmers needed creameries. They needed stockyards. They needed, you know, and somebody might be able to start this stuff. So a lot of these places still are called by that name, but there's not much to see.
What happened to a lot of these women after they left the job? Were they homeless? Did they have
Most of them
family and
went back home,
spouses?
you know.
They could go back home.
Yeah, most of them went back to wherever, other than if they were waiting for husbands or such, you know. And I did say to some of them about, did you miss working? And they said, we had enough to do anyway. You know, we didn't miss the working. It was the socializing they missed. And they worked real hard to keep it up. Anything else? Well, the books are for sale. You can sure come and look, and thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Linda.